true and terrifying horror story, inside the criminal mind of the motorcycle maniac in the city. He confessed to 39 murders, yet the most disturbing part is not the number of lives taken. It is the silence that surrounded him while he walked freely through Goiânia, unnoticed, unbothered, almost unseen. A man capable of killing without anger, without passion, without motive. A man whose emotional landscape was so flat, so anesthetized, that even seasoned investigators struggled to understand what stood before them. When Tiago was arrested in 2014, Brazil confronted not only a serial killer, but an enigma that challenged every principle of forensic psychiatry. How does someone kill so many in such a short period without leaving behind a psychological trail that anyone could detect? How does a predator live in the middle of a city, surrounded by people, yet psychologically detached from humanity itself? As a forensic psychiatrist, I have seen many forms of violence, but what Tiago represents goes beyond the common clinical categories. His actions do not align with the heat of psychosis, nor the impulsive storms of emotional collapse. They suggest something colder, a pattern of conduct that Dr. Palombo would call a conduitopathic structure, where moral reasoning detaches from behavior, a state where the act of killing is neither an explosion nor a compulsion. It is simply done without hesitation, without inner conflict, without any subjective tremor. This is not madness in the classical sense described by Pinel, nor the partial delusion identified by Esquirol. It is something more mechanical, more static, more deeply ingrained in the personality itself. And yet the psychological mystery is only the first layer of what makes this case so alarming. Because despite receiving nearly 700 years of accumulated sentences, Tiago may one day walk out of prison. A change in Brazilian law compressed penalties and created a reality that few people outside forensic and legal circles have fully absorbed. If nothing interrupts this trajectory, a man responsible for dozens of random, motiveless murders could be free in 2044. At 56 years old, healthy, lucid, and with decades of potential life ahead of him. This possibility is not theoretical. It is written into the letter of the law. It forces us to ask a question that society is reluctant to face. What happens when someone whose crimes emerged without provocation, without apparent psychological rupture, without remorse, is released back into the community? That is why, before we examine his past, we must confront the tension of the present. The countdown has already begun. Every year brings us closer to a scenario that once seemed unimaginable. His crimes did not arise from personal vendettas, financial motives, or emotional explosions. They emerged from a void, from a psychological terrain where empathy does not take root. Understanding that terrain is essential if we want to understand the dangers that linger ahead. Because Tiago's story is not just about what he did, it is about what allowed him to do it, why no one saw the pattern forming, and what may still be dormant inside him after years of isolation. This is not just a crime story. It is an inquiry into human nature, into the blind spots of mental health evaluation, and into the cracks of a justice system unprepared for offenders who kill without meaning. As we move into this investigation, consider the question that sets the tone for everything that follows. If someone capable of such violence acted without any external trigger, what assurance do we have that prison time alone will extinguish whatever drove him? The moment the city realizes a predator walks among them. Long before the police connected the murders, Goiânia had already begun to feel something shifting in the air. It wasn't spoken loudly at first. It appeared in subtle, almost imperceptible changes in people's routines. Women started walking faster at night, glancing over their shoulders, clutching their belongings tightly as they crossed empty avenues. Parents insisted their daughters avoid returning home alone. Street vendors whispered about bodies found in distant neighborhoods, each case treated as an isolated tragedy. Yet beneath those fragmented stories, an invisible thread was already weaving them together. Something was moving through the city, and although no one had a name or a face for it, the collective instinct sensed that danger was not a theoretical fear. It was here, walking on the same sidewalks, breathing the same air. In forensic psychiatry, we often speak of the psychological atmosphere that precedes the revelation of a serial offender. Communities feel the disturbance before the explanation reaches them. This is not imagination. It is the brain's ancient mechanism of threat detection, a primal alert system that activates when patterns of violence emerge, even when the conscious mind refuses to accept the possibility. Goiânia was experiencing exactly that phenomenon. A city that once carried the rhythm of ordinary life now pulsed with an unease that people could not articulate. Something had disrupted the balance. Something was taking lives with no warning, no apparent motive, no recognizable signature. When we later examined the timeline, the pattern was clear. Random victims, different neighborhoods, different times of day, no relationship between offender and prey. Crimes committed with such cold precision that investigators initially treated each case as unrelated. To the average resident, these events were tragic but disconnected. Yet the human organism has its own way of perceiving danger, even in the absence of data. People began avoiding certain streets. Conversations grew tense. A silent fear insinuated itself into daily life, as if the city itself had developed a nervous system that trembled without understanding why. This collective fear is a key forensic element because it reveals the psychological effect of motiveless crime. When murders follow a pattern linked to jealousy, revenge, financial disputes, or domestic conflict, society can categorize the danger. It feels contained, explainable. But when killings occur without reason, without connection, without narrative, the threat becomes existential. Anyone could be the next victim. Anyone could cross paths with the predator. This uncertainty corrodes the sense of safety that binds communities together. It transforms the city into a stage where every corner raises suspicion and every stranger becomes a possible threat. At this stage, Tiago was entirely unknown. No sketch circulated. No witness could describe him. No camera captured his movements. He blended into the flow of the city as effortlessly as a shadow blends into darkness. That is one of the most chilling aspects of this case. The predator walked among thousands, unnoticed, while the city wrestled with a fear it could not name. In the writings of Esquirol, this phenomenon is associated with the perception of an invisible menace, a disturbance that exists not in imagination, but in the psychological fabric of a traumatized environment. Communities sense the predator before they see him. Their anxiety is not irrational. It is the natural response to a pattern of violence too subtle for conscious recognition, but too real for the subconscious to ignore. When the murders finally began to draw media attention, people realized that what they had been feeling was not paranoia, but intuition. The city understood that a predator was indeed operating among them, a predator who struck without hesitation, without remorse, without selecting victims based on any emotional logic. A predator whose crimes were not reactive but initiated, not compelled by passion, but chosen in cold neutrality. Understanding this shift in the city's psychological landscape is essential because it sets the stage for everything that follows. It explains the fear that gripped Goiânia. It explains why the shock of his arrest was so profound, and it reveals the truth at the core of this story. Long before Tiago had a name, his presence was already shaping the behavior, emotions, and daily lives of hundreds of thousands. The invisible life of a serial killer. How Tiago operated without being seen. To understand how Tiago Henrique moved through Goiânia without raising suspicion, you must first imagine a man who appears so ordinary that he becomes invisible, not by stealth, but by insignificance. He was a security guard, a profession associated with vigilance, responsibility, and presence. Yet for someone with Tiago's internal architecture, that role served a different purpose. It gave him access to public spaces while shielding him under a presumption of normality. He was seen but never observed. He was present but never noticed. This paradox is one of the most frightening aspects of offenders with conduitopathic structures. They do not stand out because nothing in their demeanor announces danger. Their emotional flatness makes them blend into the routine of the city like a piece of its infrastructure. When investigators reconstructed his daily life, one detail stood out: the absolute absence of emotional markers. No outbursts, no conflicts, no strong attachments. He moved from home to work to the streets following the same mechanical rhythm, as if operating under a private logic impermeable to human connection. Most people leave psychological footprints in their interactions. Tiago did not. His internal world was silent, and because of that silence, he attracted no attention. In forensic psychiatry, this is not uncommon. Individuals who commit motiveless homicides often exhibit a dissociation from emotional bonds. They function adequately from the outside, yet internally, they operate in a state of psychological detachment that prevents empathy from forming. His victims were chosen at random, a pattern consistent with the absence of personal motive. He did not stalk them for days. He did not study their lives. He encountered them in fleeting moments. A woman walking alone, a cyclist crossing an empty street, a pedestrian distracted by routine. Their only misfortune was being at the wrong place when his internal impulse activated. This randomness is what deepens the horror of his crimes. It reveals not a man driven by rage, trauma, or delusional persecution, but someone whose emotional life was so muted that the act of killing became an act without psychological tension. Random crimes are notoriously difficult to trace. Without a connection between offender and victim, investigators cannot rely on the traditional threads that help unravel motive. This allowed Tiago to continue undetected for years. The city was a hunting ground calibrated to his anonymity. His job gave him irregular hours, often late at night, allowing him to drift through the streets unnoticed. His motorcycle gave him speed and mobility, enabling him to approach and escape scenes before the mind of any witness could register what had happened. Even his physical appearance worked in his favor. He was neither imposing nor memorable. He did not fit the stereotypes people subconsciously associate with danger. There is a concept in the classical texts of Johann Lavater regarding the neutral face, a visage that reveals nothing of the soul within. Lavater believed that the absence of expressive traits could be more unsettling than the presence of hostile ones. Tiago embodied that principle. A face unreadable, not because it masked emotion, but because emotion was absent. This lack of internal conflict allowed him to act with a precision that confounded investigators. The murders did not follow a dramatic pattern, they followed availability. When the impulse emerged, he acted. When it subsided, he returned to his routine. This dual existence, ordinary man by day, predator by night, was not divided by guilt or conflict. It was a seamless continuum. That is what distinguishes him from offenders driven by psychosis or emotional collapse. His behavior suggests a conductopathic personality in which moral reasoning is weakened or absent, but cognitive functioning remains intact. He understood what he was doing. He concealed his actions. He avoided capture through calculated behavior. Yet there is no indication that he sought pleasure or relief. His internal state was neither tormented nor euphoric. It was empty. This emptiness is what made him so difficult to detect. In the absence of motive, pattern, or emotional leaks, a serial killer can operate in the open. The city becomes the perfect camouflage. People expect danger to look dangerous. They expect instability to announce itself. Tiago dismantled that assumption. He lived in the center of society while psychologically existing outside it. Inside the mind, what Tiago said and what his behavior actually reveals. When Tiago finally spoke after his arrest, investigators expected the usual explanations that accompany violent offenders: rage, revenge, childhood trauma erupting into adulthood, a distorted belief system, anything that could provide a narrative, however fragmented, to anchor his actions. Instead, what they heard was a void. He stated with a tone that resembled an administrative update that he never felt anything. No anger before the crimes, no relief after, no remorse during confession. This absence of emotional oscillation is a central clue to understanding his psychological structure. What Tiago said was not just disturbing, it was diagnostically significant. A declaration of emotional opacity so profound that it challenged even the frameworks of modern forensic psychiatry. When someone claims to feel nothing, we do not interpret it literally at first. We probe. Is it dissociation? Is it alexithymia? Is it a defensive posture? But in Tiago's case, his behavior corroborated his words. His affect was consistently flat. His narrative lacked metaphor, imagery, or personal meaning. He described murders the way someone might list routine tasks. There was no escalation in tone, no tremor in speech, no hesitation in recounting the moments before or after taking a life. That congruence between statement and demeanor is something we rarely encounter. It signifies not suppression, but absence. Classical authors recognized this category of individuals long before modern psychiatry gave it names. Pinel spoke of those whose moral faculties were defective despite intact intellect, individuals capable of reasoning yet devoid of human sentiment. Esquirol's writings on partial insanity highlighted a similar phenomenon, behavior that deviates profoundly from moral norms while cognition remains undisturbed. In contemporary terms, we explore this through the lens of psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, and conduct disorganization. But even within these frameworks, Tiago's presentation sits at an extreme end of the spectrum, not flamboyant, not aggressive, not manipulative, simply empty. During interviews, he often paused not to search for emotion, but to recall sequence. His memory was not tied to feeling, it was tied to order. He recounted events with the same detachment one might use to describe an unfamiliar route on a map. This suggests a personality structure that processes human interactions without effective weight. If a typical individual perceives others through relational meaning, who they are, what they represent. Tiago perceived only presence, a shape in space, a target defined not by identity, but by proximity. This is a hallmark of conduitopathic functioning, described in Brazilian forensic literature, where moral reasoning is so eroded that behavior becomes an instrument of impulse rather than expression. One of the most revealing aspects of his confession was the inconsistency between his claimed motivations and the actual nature of his crimes. When pressed for reasons, he occasionally mentioned feelings of anger or disgust, but these claims lacked coherence. The emotional language was borrowed, artificial. He described no physical reactions, no cognitive distortions, no internal conflict that would accompany genuine affective states. This mismatch indicates that he was attempting to provide a socially recognizable explanation because the true one, an absence of inner life, would be incomprehensible to most interrogators. In forensic settings, we examine whether offenses arise from mental disorder, impulse dysregulation, delusion, or personality pathology. Tiago did not exhibit signs of psychosis. There were no hallucinations, no structured delusional systems, no cognitive fragmentation. He did not kill due to voices, persecutory beliefs, or fear, nor did he exhibit manic agitation or depressive collapse. His crimes were not fueled by emotional storms, but by a mechanical impulse, a pathological activation of action without emotional content. This distinction is essential. It positions him outside the scope of traditional insanity defenses, which rely on the inability to understand the nature of one's acts or differentiate right from wrong. Tiago understood exactly what he was doing. He concealed his actions, selected conditions that minimized detection, and resumed daily life with calculated normality. The problem was not cognition, but conscience. Not thought, but sentiment. This is the territory where the law grapples with the limitations of psychiatric classification. A person who understands reality but lacks moral grounding is legally responsible, yet psychologically dangerous in a way that defies treatment. His behavior during confession reinforces this. There was no relief, no catharsis, no emotional collapse. Confession did not arise from guilt, but from the interruption of his behavioral pattern. Once arrested, the internal mechanism that sustained the crimes no longer had space to operate. The confession was a narrative completion, not a moral revelation. Understanding Tiago's internal landscape means accepting this unsettling premise. His crimes did not express emotion, they exposed its absence. Why the crimes accelerated, the spiral no one saw forming. When investigators mapped the timeline of Tiago's murders, a disturbing pattern emerged. The killings did not follow a stable rhythm, they accelerated. What began as sporadic offenses evolved into a rapid succession of attacks, a spiral gaining speed with each crime. To the untrained eye, this escalation looks like increasing boldness or growing hunger. But from a forensic psychiatric perspective, it reveals something deeper about Tiago's internal mechanism. Offenders who kill without emotional motive often follow a trajectory driven not by satisfaction, but by repetition. Each act reinforces the next, not through pleasure but through habituation. It becomes easier, faster, less mentally demanding. The behavioral threshold lowers until the act becomes almost automatic. This phenomenon aligns with what classical forensic psychiatry described as the progression of moral anesthesia. Esquirol noted that individuals with severely blunted affect may repeat harmful acts simply because nothing within them reacts against it. There is no internal braking system, no psychological barrier, no emotional recoil. In Tiago's case, each murder did not fill a void, it deepened one. The more he acted, the less internal resistance remained. This is the opposite of offenders driven by rage or delusion, who typically show peaks of emotional overload. Tiago's spiral was not emotional, it was structural. Modern forensic analysis calls this a reinforcement loop. Not reinforcement in the sense of pleasure, but in the sense of facilitation. The mind becomes conditioned to the behavior. What was once difficult becomes easy. What was once deliberate becomes reflexive. The crimes accelerate because the offender's internal world offers no friction. When social detection fails to intervene early, the trajectory continues uninterrupted. There were no triggering events, no precipitating factors traditionally associated with escalation, no job loss, no breakup, no psychotic decompensation. His life remained monotonous and structurally unchanged. This lack of external cause is what makes his case particularly unsettling. The escalation came from within, from a psychological architecture incapable of generating emotional regulation. The impulse to kill did not erupt. It unfolded. It matured. It took place silently, unchallenged by conscience or empathy. In forensic psychology, we examine whether an offender seeks emotional release, power, or catharsis. Tiago sought none of these. There is no evidence that the murders alleviated internal suffering or produced excitement. Instead, his statements suggest a state of emotional vacancy. This means the acceleration was not a pursuit of sensation, but a reduction of inhibition. He was not escalating out of desire. He was escalating out of absence. The killings became a behavioral pathway that his psyche did not resist. This internal emptiness is dangerous because it produces unpredictability. Offenders motivated by rage or delusion can often be interrupted by emotional shifts or treatment responses. But conductopathic offenders, as described by Dr. Palombo, lack the internal switches that modulate behavior. They act because nothing stops them from acting. They escalate because nothing within them reacts to the consequences of escalating. This absence of remorse, guilt, or emotional fatigue creates what Lavater once described as neutral predation, a state where the individual neither hates nor desires his victims. They are objects within a landscape of opportunity. When opportunity meets impulse, the act occurs. As the acts repeat, the distance between opportunity and execution diminishes. This is why his final months before arrest saw a higher concentration of murders. The behavioral reflex had consolidated. Another key factor in the acceleration was the failure of early detection. Random, disconnected crimes pose immense challenges to investigators. Without motive or pattern linking cases, the offender continues operating without external pressure. This lack of perceived threat amplifies the internal loop. Tiago did not believe he was invisible. He simply existed in a psychological mode where being caught was not a relevant emotional concept. When the law does not intervene, the offender internalizes that absence as permission. The spiral accelerates. Understanding this progression is essential because it helps explain why traditional models of criminal escalation do not apply here. Tiago's spiral was not fueled by emotion, reward, or delusion. It was fueled by emptiness, repetition, and the erosion of inhibition. A silent process, invisible until the pattern finally surfaced in the city's statistics. The acceleration was a mirror into his psyche. Not a psyche in turmoil, but a psyche in suspension. And that is precisely what makes him one of the most dangerous profiles to assess, both clinically and for society. The moment everything falls apart, Tiago's arrest and the crack in his armor. When the police finally approached Tiago on October 14, 2014, it was not because of a dramatic mistake or a calculated trap. There was no chase ending in confrontation, no high-stakes standoff. His arrest occurred almost quietly, the result of small investigative threads converging at last. Yet what followed stunned the investigators. They expected resistance, denial, negotiation, anything that signaled psychological conflict. What they encountered instead was immediate confession. A man responsible for dozens of murders simply acknowledged the accusations without hesitation. That moment revealed a fracture in the illusion he had maintained for years. Not a crack in conscience, but a crack in continuity. The behavioral cycle that sustained his crimes had been broken not by guilt, but by interruption. To understand why this matters, you must consider how offenders with conduitopathic structures operate. Their external behavior depends on internal rhythm. As long as the opportunity exists and their impulses are not challenged, the cycle continues. When that rhythm is disrupted by arrest, confrontation, or environmental shift, the individual may not fight back emotionally because they were not acting emotionally to begin with. Tiago did not surrender out of remorse. He surrendered because the sequence of events that permitted his crimes had ceased. The arrest did not awaken his conscience. It merely halted his pattern. Investigators described the arrest as surreal. The man who had terrorized an entire city, whose crimes were random and brutal, did not exhibit the agitation common in captured offenders. His body language was neutral. His gaze was stable. His speech was controlled. This incongruity between the emotional magnitude of his crimes and the absence of emotional reaction to being caught is one of the clearest indicators of his psychological profile. He understood the legal significance of his arrest. He comprehended the gravity of his actions. Yet nothing in his demeanor suggested internal conflict. This is not psychosis. Psychotic individuals confronted with their crimes often respond with confusion, fear, or disorganization because their perception of reality is fractured. Tiago's perception was intact. There were no delusional justifications, no altered states of consciousness, no hallucinations. His calm acknowledgement reflects cognitive clarity, not confusion. He possessed full awareness of what he had done, which positions his actions firmly outside the realm of insanity defenses. But his emotional response was absent, which places him within the territory of severe personality pathology. Classical forensic thinkers recognized this type of presentation long before modern diagnostic systems existed. Pinel described individuals capable of committing atrocious acts with full reason but without moral feeling. Franco de Rocha referred to those who acted with perversity without delirium, meaning the individual understands reality yet lacks the moral mechanism that binds behavior to conscience. Tiago's arrest embodied these descriptions. He had no psychiatric rupture. He had no moment of madness. He had a moment of interruption. The crack in his armor, however, is subtle. It is not emotional. It is structural. When the internal rhythm is broken, offenders like Tiago lose the behavioral momentum that sustained their crimes. This loss can lead to confession, because confession is simply the next available action, not out of guilt, but out of compliance with the new condition. The psychological literature calls this functional surrender. The individual does not resist because there is no internal emotional investment in resistance. His confession then unfolded with remarkable ease. He provided details without prompting. He corrected investigators on sequences. He described scenes without hesitation or discomfort. This level of cooperation is often misinterpreted as remorse, but in Tiago's case, it was consistency with his internal logic. If the cycle was over, recounting it did not create psychological strain. His affect remained flat, his posture unchanged, his tone even. He spoke as if narrating events that happened to someone else, though he fully understood he was the perpetrator. This reaction challenges the public perception of serial offenders. People expect emotional displays, rage, fear, pride, or regret. But Tiago represented a different archetype, one that the classical forensic texts warned about: offenders who do not display emotion because emotion is not part of their psychological architecture. This makes them more dangerous, not less. A lack of emotional conflict means the behavior did not require emotional resolution. His crimes ended because he was stopped, not because he stopped. Understanding the nature of his arrest is critical to understanding the risk he poses. The interruption was external, not internal. It did not arise from moral realization or psychological exhaustion. It arose from circumstance, and circumstances can change. The confession that disturbed even the investigators. When the interrogation room door closed behind Tiago, investigators prepared themselves for the typical emotional trajectory of a serial offender finally caught: denial, bargaining, defensive explanations, or a desperate attempt to construct a narrative that softened the brutality of the crimes. Instead, they encountered a man who behaved as though he had been waiting to speak, not because he felt compelled by guilt, but because the opportunity to confess fit seamlessly into the new reality imposed by his arrest. What shocked the investigators was not the content of his confession, but the emotional stillness beneath it. His tone was neutral, his posture was relaxed, his descriptions were clinical. The absence of tension created more discomfort than any gruesome detail he might have offered. He described each murder with the detachment of someone recounting procedural steps. There were no pauses to collect himself, no tremors in his voice, no hesitations that might suggest internal conflict. He did not seek justification. He did not appeal to sympathy. He did not express pleasure, anger, or remorse. He simply recounted. This style of confession is rare even among serial murderers. Most offenders, regardless of pathology, experience some degree of psychological activation when confronted with their crimes. Anxiety, agitation, self-preservation instincts, or attempts at emotional manipulation usually surface. Tiago displayed none of these. His confession was unburdened by emotion because emotion had never been part of the acts themselves. Investigators later reported that what disturbed them most was not what he said, but how he said it. The calm cadence, the lack of moral weight, the absence of narrative interpretation. He did not view the murders through a psychological lens of regret or justification. He viewed them as events, discrete, contained, and unconnected to any personal meaning. This aligns with the forensic concept of empty intentionality, where an offender acts without emotional investment and consequently confesses without emotional rupture. In classical forensic literature, Esquirol described individuals whose actions were morally incomprehensible but cognitively intact. They could recount crimes with clarity because the act had not been internalized as transgressive in the moral sense. This is not madness but moral anesthesia. Tiago's confession reflected this perfectly. He showed no confusion, no delusion, no sense of moral conflict. Instead, he demonstrated precise recall, organized thought, and stable affect. This combination is chilling because it indicates that the barrier preventing future acts is external, imprisonment, not internal transformation. One investigator noted that Tiago corrected them when they misremembered a detail, as if accuracy mattered more than the emotional reality of the crimes. This behavior is typical of individuals with severe personality pathologies where the cognitive domain is unclouded, but the moral domain is hollow. The act of killing does not register as emotionally significant because their internal emotional life lacks the architecture to process empathy, guilt, or relational meaning. In this sense, murder becomes another action, not an emotional event. From a forensic psychiatric standpoint, the confession provides critical diagnostic clues. His effect remained flat throughout, ruling out mood-driven crimes. His narrative remained coherent and reality-based, ruling out psychosis. His behavior lacked manipulative theatrics, suggesting he was neither seeking notoriety nor attempting to craft a persona. Instead, his tone indicated that confession was simply the logical continuation of being caught. The cycle had stopped, so he described the cycle. The emotional neutrality of his recounting forced investigators to confront the possibility that his violence was not driven by internal turmoil, but by internal absence. This absence is one of the hallmarks of what Brazilian forensic psychiatry, particularly through Palomba's writings, labels a conduitopathic structure. The core deficit is not cognitive, but moral. The individual understands social rules and legal boundaries, but does not internalize them as psychological restraints. Their actions do not arise from emotional storms, but from the failure of the internal mechanisms that, in most people, generate conscience. The confession was disturbing not because it revealed hidden cruelty, but because it revealed how little inner life existed behind the cruelty. Investigators left the interrogation room not with a portrait of a tortured soul, but with the unsettling impression of a man who had no emotional register for the destruction he caused. A man who remembered everything, but felt nothing. This is why the confession carries a weight that transcends criminal procedure. It illuminates the core of Tiago's danger. He does not operate from passion, delusion, or hatred. He operates from neutrality, and neutrality in a violent individual is more dangerous than rage, because rage subsides. Neutrality endures. The truth hidden in his solitary cell. After Tiago's conviction, the justice system faced a practical and psychological dilemma. How do you contain someone whose crimes emerged not from emotional storms, but from emotional vacancy? Traditional prison environments often destabilize violent offenders, provoking conflicts, outbursts, or alliances. But in Tiago's case, the fear was different. His presence among the general population posed an exceptionally high risk, not because he sought power or dominance, but because his effective neutrality made his behavior unpredictable. Other inmates recognized this unpredictability instinctively. They sensed something in him that violated the unspoken social codes of confinement. That is why he was placed in a high-risk, isolated cell, not only to prevent him from harming others, but to prevent others from killing him. Solitary confinement stripped away the camouflage he once relied on. There he could not blend into the crowd. He could not disappear into routine or pass unnoticed. The cell exposed him to the purest form of psychological confrontation: silence. Most individuals deteriorate quickly under isolation. They develop anxiety, paranoia, derealization, or emotional decompensation. Yet Tiago remained unnervingly stable. Reports describe him as quiet, orderly, and detached, maintaining the same flat effect he displayed during interrogation. This is not resilience. It is the expression of a psyche already accustomed to emotional silence. Solitude did not erode him, because solitude mirrored his inner landscape. From a forensic viewpoint, this adaptation to isolation is deeply concerning. It suggests that the mechanisms of interpersonal connection, empathy, and relational grounding were already absent. Isolation did not deprive him of emotional contact. It merely removed something he never depended on. Classical authors warned of this psychological architecture. Franco da Rocha wrote about criminals whose inner world is so empty that confinement cannot generate remorse or transformation. Without internal tension, prison becomes not a site of rehabilitation, but a container for static pathology. During his time in solitary, prison staff observed patterns that reinforced this interpretation. He showed no interest in social interaction. He did not display irritability or frustration about confinement. He did not attempt to negotiate for privileges. His routines were mechanical: waking, eating, pacing, sitting, sleeping. Even the pacing, not common among isolated inmates, lacked the agitation typically associated with psychological distress. It was rhythmic, controlled, devoid of emotional expression. A movement performed not out of anxiety but habit. There were no recorded episodes of self-harm or spontaneous aggression, which might appear reassuring at first glance. But in Tiago's profile, the absence of behavioral outbursts is not a sign of stability. It is a sign of emptiness. Emotional crises reveal internal conflict. Tiago showed none. This internal stillness makes risk assessment extraordinarily difficult. Predicting future violence in someone whose behavior is not triggered by emotion becomes a matter of identifying external conditions rather than internal cues. Guards reported that he reacted to disciplinary instructions with compliance but not engagement. He followed orders not out of respect or fear, but out of the same neutral acceptance displayed during his arrest. This compliance is often misinterpreted as docility, but in forensic psychiatry, it is recognized as a lack of internal opposition rather than the presence of internal regulation. He does not resist because nothing within him creates resistance. More troubling are the few moments when staff tried to engage him in conversation. His responses were short, literal, and without elaboration. He did not initiate dialogue. He did not inquire about his surroundings. He did not exhibit curiosity. This flat interpersonal profile reinforces the hypothesis that his crimes did not arise from relational motives. He does not seek connection, dominance, approval, or conflict. He exists parallel to relational dynamics rather than within them. Solitary confinement, therefore, did not rehabilitate him. It preserved him. The silence did not reshape his mind, it simply housed it. The question that emerges is not whether confinement changed him, but whether confinement revealed what he always was: an individual with a static moral architecture, a man whose capacity for violence is not dependent on external triggers, but on the absence of internal ones. And it is in this absence that the true danger resides. Because if isolation neither destabilizes nor transforms him, and if his crimes were never tied to situational emotional states, then his behavior in freedom cannot be predicted by the traditional markers of rehabilitation. He is not calmer because he has changed. He is calm because he has always been calm. The legal twist: how a law change may put him back on the streets. When the public first heard that Tiago Henrique had been sentenced to nearly 700 years in prison, the number felt appropriate for the magnitude of his crimes. It created the illusion of permanence, a sense that society had found a way to mathematically express the weight of what he had done. But criminal sentencing is not a poetic exercise. It is a legal structure, and legal structures evolve. In Brazil, that evolution produced an unsettling paradox. The man responsible for one of the deadliest serial killing sprees in the country may one day walk free. The law does not allow an individual to serve 700 years. It allows a maximum of 40. With every adjustment in sentencing limits, what once felt like justice becomes a countdown. For many people, this possibility emerged as a shock. But for those of us who have worked inside forensic and legal systems, it represents a predictable intersection between legislation and public safety. The law was designed to humanize punishment, recognizing that extreme sentences violate principles of dignity and practicality. But the law did not anticipate an offender like Tiago, a man whose violence did not arise from madness, passion, or desperation, but from moral emptiness. A man with no internal break, no emotional learning curve, no remorse to build upon. When a law assumes rehabilitation is possible for any offender, it assumes that conscience can be shaped. Tiago's case challenges that foundational belief. His potential release year, 2044, forces a question that few legal systems are equipped to answer. What happens when someone whose crimes emerged without motive returns to society with his cognitive faculties intact? He will be 56 years old. Not elderly, not cognitively impaired, not physically incapacitated. Modern life expectancy and the relative safety of prison environments mean he will leave confinement biologically capable of decades of action. And because his crimes were not fueled by impulsive youth, emotional volatility, or situational stresses, the typical downward curve of aging criminality does not apply with the same confidence. This legal twist exposes the gap between what the law regulates and what forensic psychiatry warns. Sentencing structures presume that time itself contributes to desistance, that aging reduces risk, that long-term confinement reshapes personality. But Tiago's psychological profile does not derive its danger from impulsivity, hostility, or delusional thinking, traits that often diminish over time. His danger emerges from moral vacancy, from the absence of an internal mechanism that generates meaning, empathy, or emotional resistance to violence. Such structures do not soften with age. They persist because they were never dynamic. When lawmakers adjusted the maximum sentence, they aimed to correct injustices built on excessive punishment. They did not anticipate the implications for individuals whose crimes reflect static pathology. This mismatch between legal philosophy and forensic reality is one of the central challenges in modern criminal justice. The law asks, how long should someone be punished? Forensic psychiatry asks, does the individual possess the internal architecture needed for safe reintegration? These questions often converge, but in cases like Tiago's, they diverge dramatically. The legal system also operates on the assumption that external inhibition, fear of punishment, shapes future behavior. But individuals like Tiago do not respond to fear in the same way. Their emotional neutrality limits the motivational value of punishment. They do not internalize consequences because they do not experience the emotional tension that consequences are designed to provoke. For them, punishment is a condition, not a deterrent. When the condition ends, the absence of internal regulation remains. This is why his potential release is not just a legal matter. It is a public safety matter, grounded in psychiatric assessment. If his crimes had emerged from psychosis, treatment could reduce risk. If they had emerged from emotional dysregulation, therapy and age could reduce intensity. If they had emerged from situational distress, changing circumstances could restore stability. But Tiago's violence emerged from a fixed structure of personality, one that neither suffering nor reflection appears to modify. The law cannot imprison someone indefinitely without violating constitutional principles, nor can it apply different maximum penalties based solely on personality. But society must confront the implications of a system that treats all offenders as if rehabilitation were equally possible. When Tiago leaves prison, if he does, the law may declare that his debt is paid. But forensic psychiatry cannot promise that danger has been extinguished. This conflict between legal philosophy and forensic reality creates the unsettling truth at the center of this case. The justice system is preparing to release a man whose internal world remains fundamentally unchanged. A man whose crimes were not expressions of madness or emotional chaos, but of emptiness. And emptiness cannot be rehabilitated by time alone. Psychological risk assessment. What would Tiago be like in freedom? When discussing the potential release of a serial offender, society instinctively searches for reassurance. People want to believe that imprisonment transforms, that age softens impulses, that isolation forces reflection, that time heals moral fractures. But risk assessment does not operate within these comforting assumptions. It is a discipline grounded in patterns, clinical markers, and the structure of personality. To evaluate someone like Tiago, we must examine not who he was when he committed the crimes, but the psychological architecture that enabled him to commit them. That architecture is what predicts his future, not the passage of years. In many offenders, violence emerges from emotional turmoil, rage, jealousy, paranoia, delusion. These forces erupt, peak, and often diminish with treatment or aging. But Tiago's crimes did not emerge from emotion. They emerged from its absence. He did not act because he felt too much. He acted because he felt nothing. This distinction is critical because emotional drivers of violence often weaken over time, while structural personality deficits do not. When a person lacks internal emotional regulation, the passage of time does not build a conscience. It merely extends the duration of emotional emptiness. Forensic psychiatry categorizes risk along multiple axes: historical factors, clinical presentation, situational triggers, and internal mechanisms of control. In Tiago's case, historical data reflects a pattern of repeated, motiveless homicide. This alone places him among the highest risk categories in any actuarial model. But the more revealing data lies in his clinical profile. Throughout interviews, evaluations, and years of incarceration, he has not demonstrated remorse, emotional growth, or introspective capacity. His affect remains flat. His interpersonal engagement remains minimal. His internal world appears static. A static personality does not guarantee future violence, but it eliminates the protective factors that reduce risk in most offenders. Classical authors often noted that individuals who kill without passion or delusion pose a unique threat. Pinnell described such offenders as beings whose actions cannot be predicted because they arise from deficiency, not excess. Esquirol pointed to those who exhibit an absence where moral sentiment should exist. Modern psychiatry reflects this in discussions of psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, and severe conduct pathology. But Tiago's profile aligns most closely with what Palomba calls conductopathy, a profound moral anesthesia combined with intact cognition. These individuals understand what they do, they understand its consequences, but they do not internalize these consequences in a way that prevents repetition. Risk assessment requires us to consider not only past behavior, but internal breaks. Most people refrain from violence because empathy, guilt, fear of harming others, or fear of social consequences create emotional resistance. In Tiago's history, none of these mechanisms appear operational. He did not struggle with an impulse before acting. He did not process an emotional reaction afterward. He did not experience psychological disturbance from killing. If the act does not generate conflict, then memory does not generate inhibition. Another dimension of risk involves the offender's response to incarceration. Many individuals undergo psychological fatigue, spiritual reflection, or interpersonal meaningfulness during long sentences. These experiences, even when partial, can reduce risk. Yet Tiago's solitude has not produced emotional awakening or deterioration. His internal landscape has remained consistent. He is not angrier, but he is not softer. He is not tormented, but he is not reflective. A static mind does not change simply because time has passed. The most challenging aspect of predicting his behavior in freedom lies in the nature of his past crimes. They were random. There was no relational motive, no personal conflict, no situational stress. His victims were people he happened to encounter. In risk assessment, this randomness is a red flag, because it means external conditions do not need to be specific for violence to occur. He did not require provocation, emotional activation, or environmental pressure. The absence of a pattern removes predictability, and unpredictability increases risk. Aging is sometimes cited as a protective factor, but only when crimes stem from impulsivity, sexual compulsion, or emotional instability. Conductopathic individuals age differently. Their danger does not depend on youth or physical vigor. It depends on the absence of moral barriers. A 56-year-old man with intact health, stable cognition, and no internal conscience is not inherently safer than a 30-year-old one. None of this means he will inevitably re-offend. Psychiatry cannot make absolute predictions, but it does mean that the primary mechanism that restrained him in the past was external intervention, not internal development. His crime stopped because he was arrested, not because he changed. Freedom would remove that external barrier. And when internal barriers do not exist, the removal of external ones becomes a central concern. This is the uncomfortable truth behind Tiago's risk profile. His potential for future violence does not revolve around what he might feel. It revolves around what he cannot feel. And this absence, more than any history of rage or mental illness, is what places him at the highest forensic risk category. What his case reveals about Brazilian society, justice, and psychological blind spots. Cases like Tiago Henrique's do not emerge in a vacuum. They are shaped not only by the offender's internal pathology, but by the environment that surrounds them. When we analyze a serial killer, it is tempting to isolate the individual as a monstrous aberration. But forensic psychiatry teaches that society always plays a role, sometimes through action, sometimes through omission. To understand the implications of Tiago's crimes, we must examine what his case exposes about the structural, psychological, and cultural blind spots in Brazil. His trajectory reveals not just the mind of a violent man, but the vulnerabilities of a system that never anticipated someone like him. The first blind spot is the assumption that violence always has a motive. Brazilian investigative culture, like many around the world, is built around relational crime. Most homicides stem from interpersonal conflict, domestic disputes, gang dynamics, or financial motives. Police training, public understanding, and journalistic framing all reflect this. When murders occur without clear motive, the system struggles to detect patterns. Tiago exploited that blind spot without even intending to. The randomness of his crimes rendered them nearly invisible. Society is not prepared to identify a predator who kills without reason because our psychological models rely on reason, even distorted reason, to make sense of violence. The second blind spot lies in the treatment and understanding of personality disorders within the criminal justice system. Brazil, like many countries, tends to categorize offenders as either doentes or bandidos, mad or bad. But conduitopathic structures fall into neither category. They are not psychotic, yet they lack the moral architecture that anchors social norms. The law struggles to classify them because they do not meet criteria for insanity, yet they do not respond to punishment in the same way a typical offender might. Tiago is not the first case to reveal this gap, but he is one of the clearest examples of how dangerous it is. Classical theorists like Pinel and Esquirol warned about individuals whose cognitive faculties remain intact while their moral faculties deteriorate. Their writings highlight that such individuals can operate harmoniously within society until their internal structure activates violent behavior. Modern Brazil has no legal category that explicitly recognizes this form of pathology. The result is a justice system that treats moral emptiness as if it were equivalent to moral awareness. When sentencing caps were adjusted, the law assumed the potential for rehabilitation, an assumption valid for many, but not universal. Tiago's case exposes the risk of legislating morality as if it were a standardized human trait. The third blind spot involves public safety infrastructure. Serial crimes require rapid detection, interdepartmental communication, and psychological profiling. Resources that are underdeveloped in many regions of the country. Tiago committed dozens of murders before his pattern was recognized, not because investigators were negligent, but because they lacked the mechanisms to detect motiveless predation. Fragmented data, limited forensic resources, and assumptions about typical homicide patterns allowed him to operate in the shadows for years. His case highlights the need for national-level databases, integrated investigative units, and forensic psychiatric training within police departments. Another societal blind spot is the cultural discomfort with discussing evil as a psychological structure rather than a moral or spiritual concept. Brazil tends to interpret extreme violence through narratives of trauma, poverty, or madness. These frameworks are sometimes appropriate, but they fail to explain individuals like Tiago, whose violence emerges from structural deficiencies that are neither reactive nor symbolic. The idea that someone can kill without purpose destabilizes cultural narratives that rely on cause and effect. Society prefers explanations that make violence understandable, but conduitopathic violence is not understandable. It is identifiable, classifiable, accessible, but not relatable. The legal system faces its own crisis of interpretation. By limiting sentences to a maximum term, the law implicitly asserts that time can replace treatment. That incarceration itself reshapes morality. This assumption is contradicted by decades of psychiatric evidence. Personality structures are rigid, particularly when emotional deficits are profound. Tiago's behavior in prison, calm, contained, unchanged, reinforces this. He is not worse, but he is not better. He is static. And static pathology does not evolve simply because time passes. Finally, the case reveals a profound societal difficulty in confronting long-term risk. It is easier to focus on the shock of past crimes than on the implications of future ones. The thought of Tiago eventually leaving prison produces cognitive dissonance because it demands that society accept a truth it is not emotionally prepared for, that some individuals cannot be rehabilitated by time alone. The law deals with sentences. Psychiatry deals with risk. Society must reconcile the two. Tiago's case acts as a mirror. It reflects not only the emptiness within one man, but the structural emptiness in collective assumptions about violence, morality, and criminal behavior. It challenges Brazil to rethink how it understands danger, not as an episodic event, but as a structural risk that requires equally structural solutions. A countdown. No one wants to think about. The truth that remains, after every forensic analysis and every legal interpretation, is a truth society is not prepared to confront. A clock is already ticking. It is silent, but relentless. Every passing year brings us closer to a moment that once seemed inconceivable. The possibility of Tiago Henrique walking freely among the population again. Not as a rehabilitated man shaped by remorse, not as someone transformed by suffering or reflection, but as an individual whose psychological architecture appears fundamentally unchanged. This is not speculation. It is the conclusion that emerges when we examine the totality of his behavior, both during the crimes and in the years that followed. Forensic psychiatry does not predict with certainty. It does not claim prophetic power, but it does reveal patterns, structures, and risks. And what Tiago represents is a challenge to the very foundation of how society imagines change. Most people believe that time reshapes character. They believe that imprisonment forces introspection, that age mutes violence, that suffering either humbles or awakens. These beliefs are comforting, but they reflect emotional expectation, not psychiatric evidence. In individuals whose crimes emerge from emotional absence rather than emotional excess, time does not operate as a corrective. It operates as a container. When the container opens, the contents remain as they were. The countdown to 2044 forces uncomfortable questions. What happens when someone whose violence did not arise from hate, envy, delusion, or desperation returns to a society still unprepared to understand him? How do we evaluate danger in a man who has never displayed the psychological signals that usually warn of impending violence? He does not rage. He does not argue. He does not manipulate. He does not fantasize openly. His mind is quiet. His personality is still. That stillness is not peace, it is vacancy. And vacancy cannot be reformed by opportunity or monitored by intuition. Society often imagines danger as loud, chaotic, and emotionally charged. But Tiago's danger has always been silent. He killed without emotional activation. He confessed without emotional collapse. He adapted to isolation without emotional deterioration. This is the pattern that concerns forensic experts. Not because it guarantees violence, but because it eliminates the internal markers that typically signal its approach. When someone lacks emotional turbulence, they also lack emotional friction. And without friction, impulse becomes action with minimal resistance. The question is not whether Tiago learned from his time in prison. The question is whether there was anything within him capable of learning. Remorse requires empathy. Insight requires introspection. Transformation requires emotional movement. But his psychological profile has shown remarkable resistance to all forms of emotional engagement. He has not deteriorated, but he has not evolved. He exists in a state of moral suspension, neither tormented nor reflective. This is precisely the condition classical forensic authors described when they warned about individuals who remain unchanged by punishment because punishment affects only the external body, not the internal structure. The countdown also reflects a deeper societal conflict. Brazil's legal system, like many around the world, is designed around the premise that punishment and rehabilitation share the same timeline. But Tiago's case exposes how fragile that premise becomes when confronted with static pathology. The law will eventually declare his sentence fulfilled, but forensic psychiatry cannot declare his danger extinguished. These two truths are on a collision course, and the impact point is the year of his potential release. There is, however, another layer to this final reflection. It is not only about Tiago, it is about what his existence reveals about us. Our need for explanation, our discomfort with randomness, our desire to categorize evil in ways that make it survivable to contemplate. But Tiago does not fit the categories. He is neither the monstrous embodiment of rage, nor the tragic product of psychological collapse. He is something quieter, more unsettling, and far more difficult to integrate into moral narratives. A man who kills without internal reaction forces society to reckon with the limits of its own understanding. And perhaps that is the true fear beneath the countdown, not the possibility of future violence, though it cannot be dismissed, The deeper fear is the acknowledgement that there exist individuals whose minds cannot be reached by our emotional, legal, or moral frameworks. Individuals for whom time is not a healer, reflection is not a teacher, and suffering is not a catalyst for change. As 2044 approaches, the question becomes unavoidable. What do we do when the justice system exhausts its tools, but psychiatry cannot offer assurances? What happens when someone whose inner world is defined by absence steps once more into a world defined by human connection? This is not a question posed for dramatic effect. It is the central dilemma that Tiago's case leaves behind. A dilemma with no easy answer, and one that forces us to reconsider everything we believe about punishment, rehabilitation, and the nature of danger.